Inspirational Creatives, episode 199. Welcome to Inspirational Creatives. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence. Join me every Friday as I chat with successful artists, producers, and creative entrepreneurs who share powerful stories and strategies. They can help you to create the life that you want. Listen each week as these inspirational creatives show you how to take your creativity to the next level. You'll learn how to create a sustainable business that inspires others and gives you the financial freedom and lifestyle that you want. Thanks for listening. Make sure you sign up at inspirationalcreatives.com to get free exclusive bonus material. And now, on with the show. Rob here, and a very warm welcome to episode 199, the last episode of Inspirational Creatives for now. After this week's interview, and I have a very special guest for you, I'll be taking a break from this podcast to help folks like you to launch their own creative projects and podcast series, just like this one. Having spoken to you since the podcast began, I've realised three things. First, I want to get to know you better, and I need to make time for that. Second, that many listeners would like more time to catch up on this interview series, and more time to reflect, take action, and to listen to some of these episodes again. Third, and finally, I myself would like to reflect upon this series whilst evolving some of my own creative projects so that I can come back with a better podcast for you. I'm not going anywhere fast, so if you're interested in launching your own podcast, you can keep in touch with me at epicpodcastproduction.com. That's epicpodcastproduction.com, where you can learn more about how I'm sharing everything I know about launching a podcast series with all the lessons that I've learned in a few years of podcast production. And if you'd like my help with any of your creative projects, or if you would like to give me your ideas, suggestions and feedback for the future of Inspirational Creatives, you can reach me directly at rob@inspirationalcreatives.com via email. Don't forget, I read every single email I get, so you can expect a response from me there. But before we get stuck into this very special interview, I just want to say thank you to you for listening and for all of your ongoing support with Inspirational Creatives. Particularly special thanks to my wife, Sandra, and my two sons, Lucas and Leo, for their ongoing support, inspiration and understanding as I put all this stuff together for you. To share this ongoing journey of mine with you has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. And not only would it not be possible without you, the whole reason I'm motivated to do this, the reason I jump out of bed every morning and stay up late at night to do this, is to inspire you and make your life easier, hoping that your dreams come true too. So with no further ado, on with the show. My guest today is a best-selling author, an inspirational speaker, and somebody I had the pleasure of first being introduced to as part of the Inspired Entrepreneurs community in London back in 2009. He's written 14 books, including Powerful Beyond Measure and The Work We Were Born to Do. And today is somebody who has inspired not only this podcast, but hundreds, if not thousands of others to live the life of their dreams through his inspirational talks, online workshops and teachings around the world. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today, Nick Williams. Nick, welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Lovely to be here.
Thanks, Nick. So for our listener who may not have yet met you, Nick, how would you describe yourself in the world today and what it is that you do?
Great question. Exactly the questions I ask myself quite often. Who am I and what am I doing? Well, how I spend my time these days is writing and speaking and coaching and mentoring. Increasingly in the area of, I would call it inspirational leadership, but I'm sure we'll get onto that later on in the conversation. But yeah, I'm just a passionate communicator of ideas, really. I love people. I love helping people live from a sense of inspiration, from love and from, their potential rather than from their limitations and from fear. So any chance I get to do that, I'm up for it.
That sounds great. I'd love to get into your own story shortly, but before we go there, you're somebody who's very passionate about, as you just said, self-leadership. And I know from your writings and from your talks, you're very passionate about following your own heart and doing the work or living the life that we were born to have. Why do you believe these particular concepts are important to you and in the world today?
Generally, I think we live in a world that's run by fear, that's run by kind of guilt, judgment, condemnation on the whole. And, obviously wars and fighting are all part of that. So I think more than ever, we need people of heart, people of spirit, people who are leading the way. And my belief is that, each of us are born with a kind of, I suppose I'd call it almost like a spiritual promise. a destiny that we can live out. And yet I'm still quite shocked in a way of how few of us even get told that there is something we were born to do and that we do have a destiny and we do have a calling. So I think more than ever, the language I use is more than ever, we need people to unwrap who they are and what they're capable of and to unwrap their gifts. So to me, that's why we need it more than ever. In a way, nobody's more surprised than me by the impact that I've had over the last 30 years. I was just one guy leaving a corporate job to follow his heart. And now I've touched the lives of tens of thousands of people around the world, and we can all do that. There's nothing special about me. It's a capacity that so many of us have. And I just want to play whatever part I can in helping people realize that and believe it and live by it.
Fascinating. So let's talk about your own journey. Take me back to that time when you left your corporate career and what that time felt like for you back then. What was the reality of that situation like, and what happened?
Well, yeah, I had 3 kind of corporate jobs in the 1980s after I finished doing a degree. So on the outside, by the end of that, by the age of like 28, 30, I looked like I was doing well. Had a nice flat in Fulham and a corporate job in the city selling computers to banks and earning a nice salary and having incentive trips for selling lots of computers. So anyone looking at my life might go, oh, he seems to have got it together. He's done all right for himself. And yet inside, I felt like, what the heck is all this about? It wasn't hugely meaningful to me. I realized that even though I looked like a success, I didn't really feel like much of one. Felt like a bit of a fraud, like so many of us do. So inside, I was having a bit of a crisis, really. It's like, how come I look so good and feel so bad? And I'm sure that's something that's familiar to many people. So I think one of the big influences in my life has been my father, who sadly died about 11 years ago now. But my father spent his life in insurance and did reasonably well at it. But he always had this kind of parallel life as a preacher. He was a Methodist preacher. So I didn't necessarily agree with a lot of, what he preached about. But I loved his sense of having a vocation and having a calling. So when I watched him prepare his sermons, even though I didn't necessarily, agree with the biblical stuff that he was teaching, I liked the fact that he was so passionate and so inspired about what he was doing. So I think that always acted as a bit of a kind of wake-up call for me and kept the sense that I might have a calling awake in me. But I suppose, 30 years ago, I thought, well, to have a calling meant probably you had to be a minister or a social worker, and neither of those felt very appealing. So I think I had a very narrow view of what it meant to have a calling. So I realized today, in a way, that anything can be a calling. It's really why we do it that makes it a calling rather than what we do. So, being an artist, being a street cleaner, working in Tesco's, anything could, I think, be a calling today. My calling just happens to be to communicate, to be a writer and a speaker and a coach and a mentor. So yeah, I was full of fear, not a lot of confidence, but eventually, I'm sure you've heard other people talk about this, the pain of staying where I was became greater than the fear of change. So in the end, it was a kind of screw it moment where I thought, well, if I stay like this, I'm probably going to kill myself with some kind of addiction in the long term because I was so unhappy that I thought I just in a way got to satisfy my curiosity. And I'd come across something, a piece of work by Patanjali at that point, and it kind of inspired me to change. There was something about the sense of following inspiration that just felt I had to do it. Otherwise, I was going to be miserable.
You mentioned your father there. What other sources of inspiration do you remember leaning towards at that time? What was it that allowed you to move forward positively, do you think?
I'm probably being a bit harsh, but I would, describe my time in corporate life as a bit of a kind of wilderness time. I didn't go into work every day going, gosh, I'm so inspired by selling computers to Japanese banks. Maybe in retrospect, it could have been more inspiring, but for me, it wasn't. But by that time, I had discovered the world of kind of personal and spiritual growth. I'd found something called Turning Points at St. James's Church in Piccadilly, which then became Alternatives, and I got involved in that. So I'd found another world, if you like, to begin to get involved in, and that was the area of personal and spiritual growth. And I very much felt at home there. I felt like, this is the area I want to be immersed in, even though it's not really the area that I am immersed in. So there was a kind of sense of validation for me was that corporate life wasn't for me, but there was another world where I did belong. So it made it a little bit easier. At least I wasn't kind of throwing something away with nothing to go to. I was leaving something in order to enter a new world, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And how did you more practically make that change? Was it a case of just quitting your job and then figuring out what was next, or was there a slower transition for you, Nick?
Yeah, it was a pretty slow transition. I eventually left the corporate world in 1989 and I started my first business in 1990. But that was pre-internet days, pre-social media days. So, I had a little bit of an idea of what I wanted to do, but to be honest, I was still so full of fear and lacking in confidence that I pursued what I would call a shadow career for a while, which was I got involved in promoting other people and their messages, and did a little bit of my own speaking. I'd given 1 or 2 talks already, but I just lacked belief in myself. I thought, well, everybody else is the grown-up. They all know better than I do. They've got more interesting things to say than I have. So I spent quite a long time, living what I would call a shadow life, which was a life kind of parallel to the one that I wanted to be living, but not quite the one I wanted to be living. So I don't know if you want to delve into that idea, because for me, it's a very big idea, this idea of living a shadow life.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges that you were faced with that around the time. Tell me more about leading a shadow life. It almost sounds to me like something I recognise in terms of it can be a transitional phase for some people.
Yeah, and I think as long as you understand the bigger idea, I think it can actually be a healthy kind of transitional time. It depends whether you understand the idea, though. So, to give my own example, I left the corporate world to get involved in the world of alternatives. And people that haven't heard of alternatives, they can go to alternatives.org.uk. It's basically the London premier platform for mind, body, spirit thinking. They have amazing speakers come to speak there. So I started off being an audience member, then I became a volunteer, then I became part of the management team, and I ended up co-leading it for several years. And for a while, it really did feel like my calling. It felt like this is the world I want to be immersed in. This is what I was born to do. I was born to be in this world. And then after a while, I began to feel like, well, I've heard some of this before. This is a very interesting speaker, but the woman who was here 3 weeks ago said something very similar. So part of me was going, but, I could probably say something like that. This was in about kind of the late 90s. I'd been in business for about 10 years. So I did have my own business, giving a few talks and doing some coaching. But I went on holiday with my partner and we went to Lanzarote, and I took a copy of Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way, with me to kind of steal the quotes out of it, because it was full of great quotes. But then I started reading the book, and there was just a section, and it was literally like 3 or 4 paragraphs. It wasn't a significant section, but she talked about the shadow artist. And she talked about the shadow artist being somebody who gravitates towards the kind of creative or leadership field they want to be involved in, but they never quite have the courage or the self-belief to put their own talent at the center of what they want to do. So, they might support other people's creativity rather than their own. They might be a critic of other people's talent rather than put their own talent out there. And as I read this lying on a sun lounger, I had what I affectionately call, if you can excuse my language for one moment, a no shit moment, where I kind of went, oh shit, I'm living a shadow life. Because it suddenly dawned on me, I had this moment of awareness that I was running this platform to promote spiritual thinking, creative thinking, innovative thinking, and was hosting some of the leaders and the best authors in the world on those subjects. But the moment of awareness for me was, actually, I no longer want to be the one organizing the talks. I want to be the one giving the talks. I no longer want to be the one promoting authors. I want to be an author. And it was like, oh shit, but who'd want to listen to me? But it was that pivotal moment where I had a shift, where I went, I realized that I'm hiding out here. In a way, I'm very visible because I'm standing up in front of hundreds of people every week. But at the same time, I'm hiding out because I want to be the one with the message, not the promoter of other messengers.
It's funny you mentioned The Artist's Way there. That's perhaps one of my favourite books, actually. And going back to that moment then, when you had that oh shit moment and having those thoughts of, who would want to listen to me? How did you deal with that, Nick? Because that must have been another oh shit moment in some respects, because you're like, well, I want to be that person up there sharing what I've learned. But at the same time, I've now got to become that person. So then what happened?
It's a great question. I suppose I'd had a little bit of success. I'd started running workshops. I think the first talks I ever gave were from my home in Fulham. I kind of, invited people to my front room so that I could talk at them. So what I realized was I enjoyed the process of sharing ideas with people. What I lacked was the kind of confidence and self-belief to think that I had something that a lot of people would want to listen to. So, in retrospect, what I would say was I was blind to myself in a way. I didn't see what it was that other people saw in me because they weren't necessarily looking at me going, what the heck has Nick got to say? They were going, oh, what you say is really interesting. Yeah, I can really resonate with that. But I suppose Julia Cameron talks about this a lot. What we're all up against, and I've been up against it like we all have, is our own inner critic who says, who the heck are you? Who wants to listen to you? So, what Julia Cameron talks about, and I've just learned to do over the last 3 decades, really, is just to, the language I would use is be bold on my own behalf and kind of say, well, why not give it a go? I'm still doing it. I'm still in the trenches with this. But, what I'm learning to do repeatedly is kind of take the energy from my inner critic and invest it in my own inner champion and my own inner cheerleader in a way. Because most of us just get stumped by our own inner critic or our own resistance, whatever language you want to use to describe that. So I've just worked consistently on A, kind of building up my creative expression, and B, shrinking my resistance.
I was going to ask you how you built up that self-belief and confidence, but it sounds like you just went there anyway. And by being bold, you almost, and actually executing on what you were passionate about, you were able to build your confidence that way.
Yeah. On one level, I would say I've just had a 3 decade so far lesson in confidence building through doing. One of my favorite little messages I send out a few times a year on social media, I send something out every day, but one of my favorite messages when I send it out is, the first line is give up all hope. But then the second line is of ever feeling completely ready. and then, the message is just, I've learned by doing. I've learned by facing fear after fear after fear. And I think that's often where people get caught out. They're kind of waiting for that kind of mythical day when they feel ready enough, competent enough, they have enough self-belief, they feel adequate. And, I feel a lot more adequate. I feel a lot more confident these days. And it's not come from going on a confidence workshop. It's come from doing the things that I've been terrified to do and I haven't felt confident to do.
From those early experiences where you felt terrified to do those things, but you did them anyway, can you remember how it felt afterwards once you'd actually, had people around and done a talk, for example?
Yeah, well, it's still a kind of pattern. It's less of a pattern now. But the key for me is when I'm in the flow of doing what I love doing, so whether that's speaking or broadcasting or having a conversation like we are now, there is no resistance. It's like I'm in the flow. Any artist, any creative person will tell you that. When they're doing their work, it's not a problem. The problem is getting to do it and then kind of not beating yourself up afterwards for how you could have done it better.
Yes.
And that's been a pattern for me over the years is, I've managed to push through my resistance and do stuff, but then I beat myself up for not having done it perfectly or for making a mistake or missing a bit out. So, my journey has been about being bold to actually do it and then be kind on myself for having done it.
Yeah. I see that. And what I'm hearing there in terms of your experience over the last 3 decades is that it's not that these things necessarily go away or you defeat them. They still exist there, but you just develop better ways of handling them, I suppose.
The language I'm using these days, I think I heard Marianne Williamson use this language, but I've kind of stolen it from her or borrowed it from her, whatever language you want to use. But she talked about building spiritual musculature. And what she said, and what I understand that to mean is, most of us are acting out of our fear. We're acting out of our weakness a lot of the time. But building our spiritual muscular is increasing the amount of time that we act out of our strength and our courage and our boldness and our, spiritual audacity in a way. It's like we keep showing up. So I think the conclusion I've come to after 3 decades is, none of us are ever the finished article. We're all in, the language I like to use is we're all in the trenches. We're all learning this stuff. Some of us are a bit ahead of others, but we're all learning it. Just to give you an example, I'm writing book 15 at the moment. And every time I start writing a book, I go, well, I've written 14 already, so this one's going to be easier. I know it still takes me 6 months to a year to write a book. And yet I still tell myself I should be able to do it quicker by now. That over-enthusiasm still gets me. That kind of being out of touch with the reality of it still gets me. But I'm aware that it gets me rather than not realizing that it gets me, if you like. So, what I talk about is like I resist with awareness. I know precisely what I'm doing most of the time, but it doesn't stop me doing it.
Yeah, I love that. What you just said there about you resist with awareness. That's fascinating. I want to talk about resistance in just a moment. But before I do, just something you mentioned there, which I thought was fascinating. I've always respected you because you've always talked about showing up. And I think that concept in itself can instill confidence automatically. It's a case of, look, just showing up, just to turning up at the page if you're writing, or just turning up at the talk can go a long way for building your confidence and taking you to the next step or the next level. When we encounter resistance, what do you think it is that's preventing us from showing up?
My way of looking at it, this is just my way, I'm not saying it's the only way. I'm a student of something called A Course in Miracles. And in A Course in Miracles, it's a book of, it's a spiritual book about how to undo fear and return to love. And, my clarity from being a student of A Course in Miracles is there's only two things going on. There's love and fear going on, and love is of our soul and our spirit, and fear is of our ego. So we're all up against the fear that's inherent in our own egos. So I know there's only love and fear. So basically all resistance is fear. But I think what happens is we don't really understand it's fear. The way I think of it is like fear is quite clever. I don't think fear is always very wise, but fear is quite clever. So instead of us going, oh, you know what, I'm just afraid. Okay, I'll get on and do this. I'll be bold and courageous. What fear often masquerades as is sensible thinking. So an example might be, you come up with a brilliant inspired idea for starting a business or doing something creative, and then your mind starts kicking in and going, that's a fantastic idea. It's really great that you've had that idea, and what if you fell flat on your face though and it didn't work? And what if it failed and you lost money? And what if you looked stupid? And what if you ended up feeling ashamed and humiliated that it didn't work out like you thought? And you go, oh, it's probably quite sensible not to follow through then, isn't it? So resistance often masquerades as being our friend and protector, when actually what it wants to do is keep us small, and it wants us to keep us afraid. So that's where I think we have to recognize that there is only fear going on, but fear shows up in so many different ways that appear to be quite sensible. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, Nick. I think I'm just having one of those aha moments right now as you're describing that, because I never thought of fear showing up as sensible thinking.
It can be, because that's why I think thinking is an important part of leading a really inspired and creative life. What is our highest thinking? So, as a coach with my coaching hat on, I coach myself and go, well, I just realized I've gone into resistance here. How could this work? What's the best that could happen here? Whose support would I need? How would I need to grow? What negative or limiting beliefs would I need to let go of to make this happen? So I can coach myself to get back into my kind of best thinking. But most people, sorry if I'm overgeneralizing, but I think most people don't even recognize that they've gone into resistance. They just think, oh, I'm being sensible here.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you about that was, how can we spot resistance? What signs can we look for? I imagine actually sensible thinking is going to be a really hard one to spot.
Yeah, because, we can always surround ourselves probably with people that go, you're quite right. This is not the right time to be starting your own business. The economy could tank because of Brexit, this, that, and the other. So you'll always find people that agree with your sense of limitation. Just to take a step back, how does resistance show up? There are obvious ways that we would recognize, like procrastination, making wonderful plans but never taking action on them, perfectionism, addiction, too much emotional drama going on in our life, telling ourselves stories about why it would never work. There's 101 different ways that resistance can show up. But what I've also realized over the years is that what resistance can do is kind of hijack day-to-day activities. So it might be great. I'm going to start writing my book today. Oh, my partner's been nagging me to clean the windows. So perhaps just to get in their good books, I'll clean the windows. And then I'll get some brownie points when they come home from work because, they're nice clean windows. So you got our sparkling windows, but you haven't written the first page of your book. So I think resistance can then come out as like displacement activities. Anything ultimately could be a form of resistance, but it doesn't necessarily look like it on the surface.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so I don't wish to paint a too negative picture because, my belief is that we can all beat resistance. And I think the first step is to recognize it. Every act of love, every act of beauty, every act of leadership, everything wonderful that's ever happened has been testimony to somebody beating their resistance. My 14 books, my talks around the world, everything I've done has been testimony to me beating resistance. But it wasn't that I didn't have resistance. I had resistance, but I've understood it and I've got beyond it.
Mm. Looking back, what do you think were the biggest forms of resistance that you experienced?
Well, my own inner critic, just fear, really. I terrorized myself in a way. I scared myself stupid at times of what might happen if I published a book, if I gave a talk, if I went on the radio, if I wrote about certain topics. It's almost, I don't know what I believe about other lifetimes, but almost like, I believed in another lifetime I got persecuted for doing what I wanted to do in this lifetime. And there was a bit of me still hung over going, well, if I do that, I might get put to death again. I don't know if that's true, but it's almost that level of fear. And to add to it, I think some of the resistance we feel, to be honest, isn't even our own resistance. We've inherited it from our family, from our ancestors, from society. If it wasn't bad enough that we had our own resistance, then we're probably acting out some of other people's too.
Absolutely, yeah. More positively, how did you turn that around? What have you done to be able to overcome that resistance? What resources did you call upon? What changes do you feel you've been through within yourself to become this person that you are now compared to who you were then?
Great questions. So to answer your question, I'd like to add in another bit because I've thought about this a lot because, I can give some tips. I can tell you how I beat my resistance, but I think there's even bigger question before how you beat resistance. And it is that idea, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is asking, well, why? Because if I was to do a PR job on my life for the last 30 years, it could go something like this, which is, okay, so what you're saying is you want me to face all my fears, you want me to face all my insecurities, you want me to face my sense of inadequacy, all the things I avoided for the first half of my life, you want me to face in the second half of my life. Why on earth would I want to do that?
Yeah.
So on one level, it doesn't make sense to even want to go there. Why would you want to face your fear? Why would you? So I think each of us has to come up with a reason in a way, or a series of reasons why we would do that. And for me, I've kind of settled on at least two reasons why I even want to do that. Number one, I feel I'm here to grow spiritually. So every bit of resistance I face is an opportunity to grow spiritually. And secondly, for me, the more I grow spiritually, the more I can contribute. So the two things that keep me going, even during my toughest, darkest times, are I want to grow from this and I want to be able to contribute more as a result of it. Those two things are the fuel that keep me going, if you like.
That's really powerful. It sounds enticing in the first instance because it's almost a bit like choose your own adventure. If you're choosing to grow spiritually, it's like you're tackling resistance in a way that's adventurous and explorative in that sense.
I love the idea of the hero's journey that, Joseph Campbell so wonderfully talked about, that I think we all are on a journey to know our true self beyond our conditioned self. So, yes, so in a way, yes, turn life into an adventure, into facing and getting beyond all our fears and our insecurities and our inadequacies. And, and I'm not underestimating that. There are many times where I felt like giving up. It's not been easy sometimes. But secondly, how do I do that? If I could distill it all down to one thing, it would be, I think when I was younger, I thought if I just did occasional grand gestures, they would get the job done. So, I could sit around being scared for weeks on end, but then I'd do something major for a couple of days and I'd think, right, that'll be it. Then that'll get me beyond it. And I've realized it doesn't really work that way. What I realize is it's what I do pretty much every day that makes a difference. It's my habits that make the difference. So it took me probably, I've been writing for nearly 20 years, probably the first 10 years of writing, it sounds strange, but I would need to find time to write around everything else that I did. But probably for the last 8 years or so, between 9 and 11 o'clock every morning, I go out to write. I go to my local cafe and I have a latte and I write for an hour to 2 hours every day. That's what gets me through my resistance. It's showing up consistently on a daily basis to do what I'm on earth to do. That helps me get through my resistance. But other things that help me are showing up every day. I publish on social media every day. I create videos and put them out every day. So it's that commitment to showing up every day. So for me, I have developed this habit of showing up every day and beating my resistance every day. And that has really, like I said right at the beginning, helped me build my spiritual musculature. It's like, if I can do this every day, I feel stronger, I feel more confident. I have more faith in myself that I'm not going to bomb out just because I'm feeling bad one day. I do it irrespective of how I feel, if you like. But then, getting accountability, I have probably 4 to 6 kind of co-coaching relationships that I have with other people. So I don't pay them to coach me, but we coach each other. And that to me is a great way of getting myself beyond my resistance, helping other people, letting other people help me beat my resistance. So being much less of a loner than I ever used to be. I used to be, pretty a lone wolf in some respects. Just enjoying my life more in a way. It's like, I love how my life expands as I get beyond my resistance. Each time I get beyond some resistance, life opens up a bit more. But other ways, I'm a lifelong learner. And paradoxically, I think that learning can be a form of resistance. I'm sure you can resonate with the idea that, I'll just go on another workshop, I'll just take another course, I'll just read another book before I show up with what I've got to do. But I've also realized that sometimes my resistance isn't actually fear. My resistance is just a kind of ignorance. I just don't know how to do something. So when I learn how to do something, when I learn how to engage with Twitter, or I learn how to create my own videos, or I learn how to set up a YouTube channel, or whatever it is that I might want to do, when I learn how to do it, suddenly it's not so scary. So sometimes it's courage, sometimes it's know-how that we need. And sometimes it's just that building up of the muscle that says, I'm just going to keep going, I'm just going to keep walking until it becomes easier. So, one big tip that I would share with anybody listening to this is, kind of just get more comfortable with feeling uncomfortable.
Yes, I like that. And I love this idea of walking anyway, just going out and walking anyway, because I think we all inherently know that it will get easier. It inevitably has to. And I love what you said earlier too about the fact that as you spiritually grow, it gives you an opportunity to contribute more to others. And I think that's particularly not only inspirational, but also motivational too, I would say.
And for me, kind of creativity, because I know that's very much part of what you do is, I love the idea that, I really got from Julia Cameron initially, which is, our creativity is our spirituality expressed. We're all plugged into the spiritual mains.
Yes.
But, because I asked her once, I was very lucky that I got to meet her a couple of times and interview her a couple of times. And, I think she's up to something like 33 books, and as well as films and screenplays and musicals and all sorts. And I remember asking her, I said, do you think you're particularly gifted, or are you just showing us what we're all capable of if we do what you teach? And she said, yeah, I think we can all do this.
So with that in mind, Nick, I'd love to ask you, I think it was perhaps the very first book of yours that I read was Powerful Beyond Measure way back when. And I remember in that book, you wrote about how we can be unaware of how powerful we actually are. And something that's been fascinating me recently is how we can be fearful of our own success. And I remember you mentioned in that book how we are terrified, or we can be terrified of our own power or of that power. Could you talk to me a little bit about what you meant by that and how we could be, I suppose, scared or fearful of who we could actually be?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, really, and I still ponder it myself. I still very much believe it to be true, because that many people know that Marianne Williamson quote that says our deepest fear is not that we're inadequate, our deepest fear is that we're powerful beyond measure. And yet we'd kind of go, well, why the heck would I be afraid of my own power? And my answer is, I don't think, we, the soul, are afraid of our own power. It's we, the ego self, that's afraid of our own power. Because whatever you want to look at, but if you took Jesus as an example of somebody who showed up in the world and then he got crucified, and I think there's a part of all of us that kind of goes, well, if I really show up, what's going to happen? What bad things are going to happen? We don't tend to think of what good things are going to happen as a result of showing up.
Interesting.
So you're right. I still believe that most of us, not everybody, but most of us have a fear of success. We think we're afraid of failure. We think we're afraid of looking stupid and falling on our arse or whatever it's going to be. But actually what we're more afraid of is how brilliant we can be and how much we can stand out and how much difference we can make. Because it would challenge all our self-concepts. It would challenge our stories about ourselves. That's one of the things I found most challenging over the years is, the feedback I get from my talks and my books and everything that I do versus how I think of myself at times. It's like how other people see me is not how I see myself. And I think for many of us, the journey of our life is bringing those two things together.
Yes.
And one of the things that's helped me being a student of A Course in Miracles is that in the course they talk about the difference between grandeur and grandiosity. And obviously we live in a world of great grandiosity where, won't name names, but, there's just big egos out in the world that are claiming amazing things, And a lot of us go, well, if that's what it means to really show up, I don't want to do that. But in A Course in Miracles, it talks about grandeur being how we were created. And we all know that when we're in the presence of somebody who's living out their grandeur, like an Oprah Winfrey or a Nelson Mandela or, to some extent, Barack Obama. And I was very lucky 3 or 4 years ago, I got to spend an evening in London with Desmond Tutu. I was part of a group of people that spent an evening with him. And I knew that I was in the presence of a great soul who knew he was a great soul. But at the same time was very humble, but wasn't playing small. So I think what we need more people that are living from this kind of grandeur, this grandeur of spirit that's in all of us. Because I think the more of us that live from this, the more it wakes all of us up.
And in your experience, Nick, how can you begin to live a life in that way? I recognise there's probably somebody who's going to be listening to this who's probably still looking to find their path or what feels like their true path to them. What thoughts and ideas would you offer to somebody looking to live that way?
Well, I give 3 kind of major signposts to discovering what I call the work you were born to do. So shall I just share those briefly?
I would love that, Nick. Yes, please.
Yeah, for me, the first signpost, if you like, the first cleanest thing to follow is what I would call your sense of inspiration. I believe in something called inspiration. What it is, I don't know, but I think inspiration exists. And I believe that inspiration is speaking to all of us all the time, telling us this is why you're on earth. This is why you were born. This is your purpose for existence here. And most of us have got our fingers in our ears going, la, 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 la. I'm trying to find my purpose. I can't hear anything. What's going on? I'm too busy. I'm too scared, whatever. So we're not listening to our inspiration. And when we do hear it, we go, oh, crap, that seems too big. That seems too scary. I'll distract myself and have another drink or lie down or something like that. That's certainly how it's felt for me a lot of the time. It's like when I get inspired about what I'm here for, I go, oh, crap, can I really do that? That seems too big. That seems too scary. So number one is our sense of inspiration. I think it's always talking to us. The question for most of us is, are we listening? And when we hear, what do we do? Because the second kind of signpost is what most of us do. When we hear that voice of inspiration, we go into resistance, we go into fear, we go into our favorite flavor of resistance. So whether that's procrastinating, distracting, addicting ourselves, going into drama, getting busy on the internet and just researching or whatever, all of us have got our own flavors of stopping ourselves in our tracks. So, the second way is look at what it is that you're most resisting. Just be really honest with yourself. Take an honest self-audit and say, what is it that I keep telling myself I can't do? That's usually a great sign, because the thing you keep telling yourself you can't do is actually probably the thing you're here to do.
Right. Wow.
I do say, one of my kind of little kind of soundbite things is, that the more important an action or a project is to our evolution, the more likely we are to experience resistance around it.
Interesting.
So our resistance can actually be a signpost.
Yes.
And then the third way that we can find what we were born to do is, we've alluded to it already, really, which is in your shadow life. There's a very good chance you're close to it already. And either you're recognizing it and go, no, it couldn't be that. That's too big. That's too lovely. Surely not me. Or if you're not aware of it, if you realize that you've spent 20 years supporting other leaders, there could be a good chance that you've actually got some leadership skills and qualities of your own. Or if you spent your life supporting other writers or supporting other artists, there's probably a good chance that you'd like to be a writer. You'd like to be an artist yourself, because that's what you keep gravitating towards. Does that mean that every theatre critic would really love to be an actor? Probably not all of them, but probably a lot of them, yes.
Wow, that's they're 3 really powerful things there, Nick, and most insightful too. I think these ideas of how we can use seemingly kind of negative circumstances such as resistance and living a shadow life as clues, I suppose, as to what we could really become. In your life, Nick, how does resistance, you mentioned there about how sometimes when we are actually on the path to our true calling, if you want to term it that way, you encounter greater resistance. How do you marry that up with this sense of flow that people talk about in terms of finding themselves in creative flow as a signal that they are also on their true path?
We could have a whole conversation on this, but just to give you the headlines, the way I think of it is what we're on earth to do is not difficult, ultimately. Often we'll actually find it really easy. What's difficult is our resistance to doing it. So it's not necessarily difficult to write, but it might take you years to get past your resistance to actually sit down and write.
Got it.
And then you may go, what the heck was all that fuss about?
Yes.
I love this. The me that is about to give a talk to a couple of hundred people is often scared. But then the me that stands up within a minute of giving the talk, I'm in my flow.
Yes.
But it's having, what I call a spiritual kind of pro mindset, having this kind of pro mindset that says, you know what, I know I'm going to experience resistance, but I'm wise enough to know that I don't need to be stopped by it.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So it's seeing beyond the resistance, whereas when we're a bit less aware, we kind of go, well, I'm scared, so this is obviously isn't the right thing for me to do, as opposed to the kind of more pro mindset that says the fact that I'm feeling so scared means this is probably precisely the right thing for me to do.
Yes, I love what you said there about seeing beyond the resistance. Yeah.
And the reality is for most of us, that most good things in our life are going to be just on the other side of a bit of resistance.
Yes.
Or a lot of resistance, depending on what we've got going on.
Absolutely. Before we begin to wrap up, Nick, this has been a fascinating conversation already. What does it mean to you to live a creative life? You mentioned living a creative life earlier.
For me, there is a constant feeling of evolution. Not necessarily a smooth, but, I don't know if you remember, but about 4 years ago, I got ill for one of the first times in my life. I got hepatitis. I don't know if you were aware of it, but I was giving a talk in the Sudan, in Khartoum, and I picked up hepatitis while I was there, and it sent me into a real dark time. I was physically ill, but I kind of lost connection with my own joy and inspiration for a while. But I knew that on a deep level, this was about an evolution. I'd kind of plateaued in my life and almost felt like my soul was saying, you've got a bigger game to play, but you've got to clear some stuff out. You've got to clear some resistance out to play this game. So I feel like a lot of the last 4 years for me has been about a new birth, but I've almost had to go through a bit of a death in the last 4 years to have this new birth. But I feel like I'm having this new birth. So for me, part of living an inspired life is having the low times where almost sometimes a death has to happen so that a new birth can emerge. For me, it's about the language I use is about self-liberation, is becoming freer and freer within myself, simply to be myself. And not so much in a like, well, screw you, I don't care what you think about me, but it's like, well, I like me, and I hope you like me too. But if you don't like me, I'm sorry, that's okay. I like me. It sounds so simple, but it's taken me, nearly 5 decades to get, well, I'm 59 next week. So it's taken me a long time to even be able to say, I really like me, I'm okay with me.
It's almost authenticity isn't necessarily something that you arrive at. It's ever evolving in that sense.
Yeah. Me being authentic 10 years ago is different to me being authentic today, and probably be different in 10 years' time. Yeah. So, yeah, we can be authentic in each moment, and that will keep evolving. And yeah, for me, it's about expanding awareness. And my kind of new project is about moving into the area of kind of inspirational leadership much more. So wanting to own being a leader more and kind of redefining what it means to be a leader and to incubate the leadership in others. And that's the kind of new chapter that I'm unfolding myself right now.
Excellent. I'd love to ask you about what's coming up for you, so I'll do that in a moment. But before we do, we've covered a lot today. Is there anything you'd like to add before I ask some closing questions in context of what we've discussed today?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, for me, we've touched on it, but how important it is to bring what I would call skillfulness into the equation as well. That if we're going to become masterful at what we do, it's partly about inspiration, it's partly about courage, and it's also about skillfulness. I think there was a quote from John Ruskin that I read many years ago that said, when love and skillfulness come together, expect a masterpiece. And I think there's often a bit of naivety in people that says, well, if I'm just inspired enough or if I'm just courageous enough, it'll all work out. And that's an enormous part of the equation. But I think we sometimes underestimate the power of good thinking, the power of skillfulness, the power of strategy, especially if we're going to run a business around our own creativity and our own inspiration, our own leadership. You know, we've really got to understand kind of how the world operates and how to engage with the world on its terms to bring our gifts into the world, if you like.
Yeah, I love that. And that takes an element of skillfulness and almost craft in some respects. It's about mastery and craft.
Yeah. And also, if we're developing our craft over a long period of time, when the inspiration comes, we know what to do with it.
Right. Yes. Because I think that is something we do face. We get the inspiration, but we don't quite know what to do with it.
No. Whereas now, you know, I've got this inspiration for this new project and a new book and all sorts of things. And I feel like I've got many of the skills I need now, but I didn't feel like I had them a few years ago. So I've got a mixture of the skills and the confidence to do this now.
Yeah. So there's an element of timing at play in many respects.
Yeah, that we're all kind of maturing, you know. So obviously I am older now and I've got a new level of maturity that I can handle things that I probably couldn't handle when I was younger.
Yeah, fascinating. So just to wrap up then, Nick, why do you believe it's important to be continually inspired?
Because I think inspiration wants us to be continually inspired. So I do believe it's an evolutionary force. And I think for many of us, I certainly grew up thinking inspiration could be an occasional visitor, but it wasn't really an essential part of life, that you couldn't really bank on it being there, and it didn't have a kind of a purpose in a way. Whereas today, I would very much say that I think being inspired on a fairly regular basis is almost is a necessity for emotional and spiritual health. I think it's very difficult to be emotionally and spiritually healthy and be uninspired most of the time.
Yeah, I like how rather than inspiration just being something on the side, it can be a focal point of our life where things can kind of revolve around it. I like it being the centerpiece. Well, not necessarily the centerpiece, but certainly a big player in the context of everything else. On that note, Nick, I know this is a question you like to ask others. What's inspired you recently?
My concern is I might sound a bit big-headed with the answer, but it's me stepping into my grandeur in a way. It's like I'm actually quite inspiring myself at the moment.
Right. Great. I love that.
By what I'm kind of incubating and what I'm wanting to bring into the world. Yeah, and there are dozens of people around me that are inspiring. I've just read Bruce Springsteen's Autobiography. It's taken me several months to read it, but I just finished it a couple of days ago, and I was very inspired by his openness and his authenticity and his struggles with depression and all sorts of stuff. And so I was very inspired by reading that. I'm inspired by people that show up and are heartfelt in the world.
Do you find, just hearing you talk about Bruce Springsteen there, do you find that even though we are all so different and unique in that sense, in many respects, we all share very similar journeys? Yeah, you know, and to me, you know, one of the things I grew up believing was that there was a lot wrong with me, you know, and then when I look at Bruce Springsteen, who's somebody at the top of his game, who's had such a global impact and uplifted and inspired so many people, and then to hear what he's suffered within his own personal life and his own upbringing and his own depressions and stuff, it's like, well, I think I used to think that having problems excluded me from doing amazing things. And I think what I now realize is even the people that do the most amazing things on the planet still have problems in their lives. That being human is not about not having problems. Being human is about being inspired and creative and leadership. And we still struggle with things while we're in a body, whether they're emotional things, spiritual things, health problems, whatever it is. Being human means having problems. We're never going to escape them. But it doesn't exclude us from still doing amazing things. Yeah, that's great. That's really great. Fabulous. And Nick, I'm incredibly grateful for your time and having you and your voice on the show today.
My pleasure.
What are you grateful for?
Life. My partner of 20 years, she's been by my side on a lot of this journey. My dad, although he died 11 years ago, I'm grateful for the inspiration that I got from him. And funnily enough, you know, my mum's nearly lost her memory to dementia now. It's been a very tough journey I've been on with her, but I can see even the journey I've been on with her, that how difficult it is, has been full of blessings in a way. You know, there's a lot of, I try to find gratitude even in the most difficult of circumstances, and losing somebody to dementia is obviously one of the most difficult things you can do. And I'm even beginning to be grateful for for that now. How it's made me grow and become more compassionate and understanding, patient.
Yeah, and what those challenges can teach us, I suppose.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm a believer that even the biggest challenges are there to draw something out of us. And it has to be in there in the first place for it to be drawn out. So, yeah, even be grateful for the difficulties and what they've drawn out of us, yeah.
Fabulous. So what's next for you, Nick? You've got a new book on the way. Can you give us a clue to what that might be about?
Yeah, I'll mention it here. This is one of the first places I've mentioned it. But yeah, following on from the theme that I followed, it's going to be called The Leader You Were Born to Be. At the moment, the subtitle is Inspiring the Best in Yourself and Others, because I do think one of the purposes of inspiration is to draw the best out of ourselves. And I believe we need more people in leadership, whether that's positions of leadership or just out in the world, who are drawing the best out of themselves and are committed to drawing the best out of the people around them rather than trying to control them or put them down or whatever. So that's what I want to play a part in, is incubating more inspirational leadership.
Fantastic. And any ideas when the book may be out?
No, but I'm beginning to talk on it and I'm beginning to write about it. So, the book won't necessarily be the first thing, but I'm hoping to have it out by the end of this year, 2017.
Well, in which case, I imagine our listener will want to stay in touch with you and learn more about you and the work that you do, Nick. So where's the best place to stay in touch with you?
Well, if you go to my website, which is just the words nickwilliams.com, you can contact me through there. I'd love to hear from you if there's something that, has touched you from this conversation that we've had. And you can sign up for kind of daily thoughts about inspirational self-leadership and the leader you were born to be. So just put your name and email address in and you'll get kind of daily inspiration and hear about the other stuff that I'm up to.
Super. So that's IamNickWilliams.com.
That's it. Brilliant.
Fabulous. Nick, thank you once again for your time today.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me and thank you for listening to this.
Thanks for listening. Nothing beats the stories and advice of an expert to help you raise your creative game. I would love to know what you thought about today's episode, so don't forget to subscribe in iTunes where you can rate and review the show. If you like this episode, I invite you to share it on Facebook or Twitter with the one person you know who will benefit from the wisdom shared here today. You can find the show notes on inspirationalcreatives.com/podcast. If you have a burning question or a great idea for a guest, head on over to inspirationalcreatives.com/contact, where you can connect with me there.